Good morning, sir. Have we got some sound?
Okay, can you hear me?
Perfectly. Perfect.
Okay, good.
Good morning. Oh my goodness. Well, yeah, good morning for you and stupid good morning for me. It's 2 a.m. here. So thank you for doing
No
this.
way. Where are you right now?
I,
Australia?
I'm in Coffs Harbour, Australia. Yeah, so
Oh
regional
man,
kind of area. Yeah.
it sounds wonderful.
It
Australia is a
is.
great
Mm.
place.
Well, man, I tell you, I used to believe that wholeheartedly, and I still kind of do, because I wake up, it's a real dichotomy in someone's head that I wake up, I'm about to pick up my kids tomorrow for Christmas holidays, and I look at this perfect weather, this perfect paradise, and yet it's juxtaposed with this insanity environment that's having its effect on mindsets that's unprecedented.
It's a mental disease. We're way beyond the respiratory disease. Okay, I have patience after this, so we can get going, and you can take it anywhere you want to, Glenn.
I'll be honored, Peter. Thank you. Well, let me sort of do the I suppose the yeah, let's do the initial. So we've got folks today. I'm having the honor of interviewing Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough is now there's a lot of terms, and this is us, Peter and I, we got familiar for about 20 seconds before I pushed record and we said starting. So we're really just getting into this. But when I've listened to several interviews with Dr. McCullough, with Bret Weinstein on the Dark Horse podcast, which just over an hour really filled me with dread, optimism, and thoughts, I suppose, that someone seems to be asking the right questions and applying some form of critical thinking. And then when my partner, Naomi, saw this meeting at 2 a.m. In my diary that I didn't tell her about, she messaged me and said, is that Peter McCullough, again, who was on Joe Rogan literally this morning? So your interview with Joe Rogan dropped today here in Australia. So, but in your bio, there are terms like internist and cardiologist and a lot of medical terms that kind of us lay people, which certainly I am, are completely unfamiliar with. So if you could kind of map out, I suppose, firstly, why someone should listen as intently as I did after hearing the evidence-based procedure that you have utilized with having a think about COVID and some of your things. If you could outline your credentials, just so people can know we're not talking to some far-right quack with no right to sort of talk about these matters.
People are searching for the truth. Glenn, thanks for having me on the program. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I am a practicing internal medicine physician and cardiologist, and I'm trained in epidemiology. So what that means in the United States, in internal medicine, is the practice of adult medicine disease. And so that's considered a base of primary care that requires 3 years of residency training after medical school. In the United States, we do 4 years of university work. It's considered undergraduate work. So I have a bachelor's degree from Baylor University in Texas, the oldest university in the great state of Texas. And then I have 4 years of medical school at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, in the top 50 medical schools in the United States. And then I did 3 years of residency in internal medicine as board certified internal medicine at the University of Washington in Seattle. That is the top medicine program in the United States. And then I have a master's degree in public health in epidemiology from the University of Michigan. And epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease. That's an additional research degree, and that's in the top 5 schools of public health in the world. Then I went on and I trained in cardiology at William Beaumont Hospital, now the William Beaumont Oakland University School of Medicine. And at the time, that was the leading cardiovascular center in the United States. And today, I practice both internal medicine and cardiovascular disease. So I handle adults with general medical problems, high blood pressure, diabetes, infectious diseases, as well as focused on those with heart disease. Now, my research has been focused on heart and kidney disease. That's the reason why I maintain that broad base. I'm the president of the Cardiorenal Society of America, a national organization. I am the editor-in-chief of Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine, a leading peer-reviewed, cited review journal in cardiovascular medicine. I'm the former editor-in-chief of Cardiorenal Medicine, a international journal that's headquartered out of Switzerland. I'm the editor-in-chief of the first inaugural textbook on cardiorenal medicine. I have over 650 publications in the National Library of Medicine, and that's in the top echelon of all academic physicians in the world. And since COVID-19 hit, I've completely dropped my current activities and focused completely on COVID-19 because I saw a great need for all skilled medical specialists to apply their scholarship and their clinical care to take care of the biggest medical problem of its time. I now have 52 publications in COVID-19. I've been relied upon for advice of the U.S. White House. I've testified in the U.S. Senate, multiple state senates, and other venues. I'm a frequent contributor on Fox News, but many other news channels, and have made the rounds with podcasters like yourself, Glenn, and recently Joe Rogan, but also many other ones, Tommy Kerrigan, and many other terrific podcasters out there. I've been, guest on Tucker Carlson show and many others. And the reason why is because my analyses have been accurate. And I've actually correctly interpreted and predicted all the major inflection points in the pandemic and pandemic response. I haven't been off on one yet. So the initial ones dealt with really developing ways to treat COVID-19 to prevent hospitalization and death. And those have been completely supported and well developed now, additional drugs coming in. And now most recently been analyzing both efficacy and safety with the COVID-19 vaccines.
And that really brings a myriad of questions. So what I will certainly draw people's attention to, given our time constraints, and just please forgive me, how long have we got now from when we started?
We'll have at the top of the hour, we'll have to finish.
Okay, understood. So I do want to be very, very respectful of your time, given those credentials and given who you've been working with. You mentioned something in there, which is peer review. And here in Australia, this is why us consumers, us lay people, are having so much problems. It's almost like I wanted this interview to almost be my line in the sand for what my thinking was when my kids ask and my grandkids ask 50 years from now saying, Dad, how could you? And so, when I see experts saying one thing who supposedly, because historically, all we would ever do as lay people is ask our doctor, is ask our leading medical bodies, so to speak, and they would give us advice. And there was consensus with doctors for best care, but the doctor-patient relationship always seemed to be primary, and we would just trust those doctors. At the moment here in Australia, I put up a post saying, can anyone give me the rules that they are telling doctors here in Australia? Because I've got a meeting with your good self, and I tell you, the amount of people saying, I asked my doctor, they said they couldn't talk. And there was so much almost gag orders on our doctors. Now, I tried to find those gag orders in official circles, and no one would be able to point me to some regulatory body that is forbidding doctors from speaking. But I tell you, it's that sort of lack of peer review, lack of consensus among experts, including yourself, that is scaring the hell out of us consumers to not know what to do and who to believe.
Yeah, one of the products of that is the lack of fair balance. I know in Australia, there probably are TV commercials for various medicines. I know there are in the United States. So for instance, if there's a psoriasis medicine and they show somebody whose skin is cleared up and they're swimming in a bathing suit and they're happy, there's always a few disclaimers there that says, warning, these are the warnings and concerns that could happen with this product. There's always fair balance. In fact, that's written into law. But those who right now are promoting the vaccines are not offering any fair balance. They're not telling Australians about what could happen if they took the vaccines with respect to risk of death or of various organ system injuries, permanent disability. So the lack of fair balance, I know in America, really has people concerned because they know, listen, everything has some risks and benefits. Yes. And so they need a fair discussion on the risk. They've been told to take the vaccine. They understand that, but they need to know what's going to happen to their body. What could go wrong?
Well, certainly here in Australia, we don't have, because I've traveled to America a million times, a lot of times, and I see those commercials with those disclaimers and those fine prints. They don't have that here. It may even be that medical treatments are, maybe we're not allowed to, in a regulatory sense, put broadcast advertising for medications here in Australia. So hence we rely on our doctors to prescribe the given thing. And if that's the case, when there's this much controversy and we even get a hint that our doctors may have their opinions tainted by political outcomes, it scares us consumers, 3/4 to death. So I do want to just quickly share my screen with my particular, let's just say, evidence that I wanted to show you some of the things here in Australia. So guys, for those of you who really want an in-depth analysis, I can't recommend more Dr. McCullough's interview for 2 3/4 hours with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan podcast, available free on Spotify, and the Dark Horse podcast with Bret Weinstein, because Bret is a PhD in evolutionary biology, a first principles thinker he is so careful with his language to not make sweeping broad statements, not make the sorts of statements that our politicians are making, that is, it's safe, it's free, and it works. Like these broad statements that are shoved down our throats without any nuance discussion, without any discussion of side effects, without any discussion of treatment whatsoever. They literally, treatment here is fluids up and go home and go away. Like go home to die. So those things, I would definitely say go and watch Peter's interviews with those folks. But let me show you this, Peter. This is our Australian Bureau of Statistics website. And so I guess I wanted to get your take on this website, abs.gov.au. That is our Australian Bureau of Statistics. And what it is saying, in 2020, Australia lost 898 people to COVID, where COVID is the underlying cause of death. So not quite 1,000 people in 2020. And in 2021, I think our total now for really 2 years of COVID is about 2,000 people. So about 1,000 a year, let's just say, for broad numbers. This here, once again, the Australian Bureau of Statistics website, this is cause of death. And this, I just chose 2018, but this website tracks it. And what it says here, that influenza and pneumonia, and most Australians will agree that the ABS is beyond, what's the word? Manipulation, let's just say. So influenza and pneumonia, in 2018, 3,000 people per annum die of influenza and pneumonia. 2,000 in 2013, I believe that next column was. Yeah, so influenza and pneumonia, 2,500 then. So we could sort of say, round figures, that 2,500, 3,000 people a year die here in Australia of influenza and pneumonia. And COVID, we have lost 1,000 of that 1,000 people per year. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is, where is my thinking flawed when I say we've got a state of emergency declared here that has got rushed to market vaccines with no proof of long-term effects. We've got virtual bans on ivermectin and any other treatments that have been postulated by experts like Dr. Pierre, that Bret and Dr. Pierre and have hypothesized. They don't even say it works. They say, here's some studies and it's sounding good. And we know it's safe because it's won a Nobel Prize. It's been administered 4 billion times and all of those things. But we know it's safe. We suspect it might be good. My logical thinking would say, just try that. But where's my logic flawed when I say this COVID thing here in Australia seems to be less mortality, 1,000 rather than 3,000, and yet it's the thing that has spurred on a state of emergency that has our freedoms being totally curtailed. We have show us your papers at every state border. To enter businesses, we are unallowed to do so without this double vaccination of this experimental thing. Can you see a way that these numbers and these statistics are flawed, or my thinking is flawed in some way?
To make it probably more clear, I've testified under oath in the Texas Senate in March of this year that 85% of these deaths were avoidable with early treatment. It's now called the McCullough Protocol. It was published in August of 2020. So Australians had this available to them. We've been communicating with the COVID Medical Network in Australia all the way through. So we've been very communicative. And so of those, let's say 2,000 deaths in Australia, we're really down to probably 300 deaths that could not be stopped due to COVID-19. So 300 deaths would be basically a very minor cause of death in Australia. And you have more accidents and suicides, honestly, there. So at that level of illness, one could say, listen, just go back to normal. Just stop all this, stop all the activities at the border, stop all the vaccinations, just return to normal. I've been to Australia, in the last 10 years, and it's a very normal country. Some parts of Australia are like where I am in Dallas, Texas. Others are as nice as San Diego or better. And, enjoy your wonderful country. COVID-19 is, not much of a threat to your country. I think the naysayers would say, listen, because we locked down so severely, because we took all these measures, we have really limited the damage that could have happened with COVID-19. And because we are so successful, we're going to double and triple and quadruple down on our activities. So that's the issue of how much of this is a self-fulfilling prophecy now, and how much of it is just a complete overreaction. I can tell you at the first analysis, if this was all really about COVID-19, Australia would be leading the way on early treatment. And Australia is not viewed as a leader in early treatment. In fact, I don't think there's been any significant research or protocols developed in Australia on how to treat Australians. And you've got leading institutions, Monash, others. I've been to Sydney, I've been to Adelaide, I've been to Canberra. You have wonderful institutions in Australia. They just have not shown leadership in the treatment of COVID-19. And so in a sense, Australia is going to follow leaders. There are leaders in France, in the United States, and South America, South Africa. So it's been an interesting 2 years, but I think the recipe for conclusion, especially for Australia, is just open up, stop all this, literally drop all efforts on pandemic response. And as COVID-19 develops in communities, start early treatment protocols, which are now widely available with widely available drugs.
And it seems that the treatment protocols are non-existent here, and again, we don't know what a doctor is or isn't allowed to do. We don't know what, we've heard terms historically like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm and things of that nature. It seems crazy to me that if something is not harmful, like you called it which protocol did you call it?
It's called the McCullough Protocol.
Oh, okay. The McCullough Protocol. Wonderful. We need to get that. And yet we can't go to our doctor and say, hey, I'd like to try the McCullough Protocol. They're going to say, no, you can't do it. Go home and do nothing. That seems to me to be against every premise of medicine, where we entrust our safety to a doctor's, sometimes even intuition and best guesses. And it seems that has been trumped by some policy that is really getting a wedge in the way of the doctor-patient relationship. I mean, have you spoken to any medical practitioners down here about how a doctor can literally be gagged from providing any treatment whatsoever? Because, it seems crazy to me that the treatment is go home. And by the way, the minute you're over this, go get yourself some jab action. And it just seems it's vaccine, and nothing else is to be discussed, even spoken about.
Well, denying patients treatment in the United States, that's called malpractice. That's actually a civil infraction of the law, and that's clearly a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. Hippocratic Oath says that doctors have to do their best for all the patients, and it's clear with a fatal disease, doing nothing is not doing one's best. In fact, it's a violation of the precautionary principle. Precautionary principle guided all of us in developing early treatment, because it basically says this is a mass casualty event. People are dying right in front of us. We must take action now. We cannot wait for large randomized trials. We can't wait for guidelines that will depend on large randomized trials because the time frame is too long. It's 2 to 4 years easily, another 2 years on top. That's 6 years before we'll ever have guidelines to treat patients as an outpatient. The outpatient studies are very different than inpatient studies. They take a lot longer because you have to set up treatment centers, et cetera. So we look for drugs with signals of benefit, acceptable safety, use drugs in combination, and then we have been eclectic in bringing new drugs on. When the monoclonal antibodies came in and had very good data, we brought them in. We're now looking at the Merck drug, molnupiravir, and the new Pfizer drug, which is a kinase like 3 inhibitor, protease inhibitor. We'll bring them in as well. I mean, that's what early treatment is all about. It's just like cancer chemotherapy. We start with something, and then it gets progressively refined over time. And so, the early treatment message has gotten out. There are worldwide programs. Dr. Tess Lowry in the UK is leading an entire organization. It's an umbrella organization. I think she said she's up to 70 different early treatment organizations worldwide. We have several of them in the United States. And you can see that this is the same infection all over the world. So if Australia is doing something different than the rest of the world, that should be a red flag, right? So Australia should be in the same situation as the rest of the world as we move forward. It's clear whether or not someone took the vaccine, they can develop serious COVID-19, and they deserve early treatment.
Well, one of our states has just, and unfortunately, my home state, because my kids live in a different state than than one of my other children, right? So I'm constantly traveling across state lines. And one of those state lines, there has been the hardest border lockdown that I think is in the world, meaning you know, even as a resident, you cannot go home unless, and then the list since COVID started has gotten longer and longer and longer of how you can get home, to the point where last time I visited my kids before this time, I was stuck homeless without the ability to go home. And they've had, again, understandably, with such a large isolation principle, he's just said, nope, no one in, no one out, period. And they've had virtually no COVID. Has that state in particular, but then Australia at large, given that we have not had COVID sweep through it, are we like a forest with, let's just say, kindling on the forest floor, just waiting for a fire? And the minute we even hint about opening up, it's going to rip through us like it has ripped through the entire world. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, Australia does have a large susceptible population. And I think when Australia does open up, you have a large migrant workforce. I remember in Sydney, the Sydney Harbor, people coming in from East Asia as workers, et cetera, that you do have a large susceptible population. As an epidemiologist, I have to tell you, I am amazed when we look at Indonesia, the Philippines, the Thai Peninsula, look at Taiwan. I'm amazed at the relatively low incidence and prevalence rates of COVID-19. In the United States, we're very similar to Australia in terms of our population. We obviously have Hispanics and African Americans, but we have a big Caucasian population like Australia. In America, we have the most number of cases and the most number of deaths. So, wow. For some reason, this has been with us at a high density for a long period of time. Australia's been spared. May just be kind of regional differences there, but I think you can take that. You have a low prevalence of disease, and at some point in time, you're going to have to open up. It looks like the pandemic's not going to stop. It just, things just keep going and going and going. What I wonder is, how is Australia really enforcing border restrictions? It's such a large country. How do you have enough police officers to stop everybody at every border crossing? United States, we just cross from state to state. I don't think they could ever stop. We got 1 million country roads that go across state lines. How could they possibly begin to enforce such a situation?
As someone who's traveled across the borders a lot, I know with that one in particular, Western Australia, I think it might be because, and perhaps that's even why we've got such a low instance of COVID. I mean, here's the thing. Every layman now, like me, I have no medical training. I have no anything, and yet everyone now is a a Facebook epidemiology expert. We're all just sitting here with our own opinions as to why things, like I'd never heard of most of these terms before 2020. I wonder if low population density, our entire country has as many people as LA has, and yet geographically our country is the size of the USA. So I wonder if it is just such a low population density, hence there is less interpersonal, we call it social distancing nowadays, another term I'd never heard of before. So maybe naturally we social distance just because there are so few people here per square meter of land. And perhaps vitamin D is so prevalent here because it is such a sunny country that maybe those geographic things, but certainly what I would say is for that reason, WA really has one road in, one road out. So if they control that road and the airport, they've controlled that state pretty much. New South Wales, certainly I've crossed at 2 or 3 of the main border positions within my 2 states here on the East Coast, Queensland and New South Wales. And yeah, because the 3 that are primary, they've blocked off the ones that are, sort of relatively less manned, less utilized. And then the major ones, they get them manned by police, which is the scariest thing in the world. Like when COVID first hit and I traveled from West Australia to Queensland and I got off a plane and I was met by our Army personnel, which is a federal organization, Army, our SES, which is our state emergency service, sort of our frontline workers for all sorts of emergencies and things, and police. So I was met by 3 authority figures in almost like riot gear and PPE and things. And here I am as a consumer going, what the hell has happened to freedom? It seems gone. And really, it's sort of waxed and waned based on how the current number of cases, but we've never gotten those freedoms back. And now we are being asked to check into businesses to what they call contact trace. So they know our every movement, they know our vaccination status, and they are asking for it and requiring it. And it's so I would suggest, to answer your question, how they're getting away with it logistically, they've mobilized a police force to really be focused on that. And what that says to me is, what the hell did they used to do that they've got all this time free? So that means there's crime being let go. But it just seems like this is insane for something that is less deadly. Because I used to live my life not knowing there were 3,000 people a year died of the flu. I used to live my life with zero thought to risk of flu. And this thing here seems more deadly. Well, we're told is more deadly than flu, but the numbers tell us different. And yet our entire way of life and freedom seems to have been curtailed based on this thing that is less deadly than this thing that I used to not even put an ounce of thought to.
Are they putting time limits on the durability of the vaccine? Is it a binary situation where you're vaccinated or not, or is it just you get 3 months of freedoms or 6 months of freedom?
Yeah, that's the thing that scares me to death, Peter, is that I saw the way that it went the first few times. First, vaccines are here and they're available to people over 65. They're available to. Then the next term was, they're available to people 50 and it went down or whatever. Then it was, we're strongly encouraging over 65. If you're at risk, we're strongly encouraging. Then we're, really strongly encouraging. Then they started requiring, and they started using terms like mandate. Again, a term that they're even debating. Is the word mandate mean it's law? Because it hasn't been out through our parliamentary procedure. It has just been kind of decreed by the equivalent of our premiers, which is the equivalent of your governors and a governor's a chief health officer. So it's just sort of, they're saying the word mandate. And most of us lay people are accepting the word mandate as you must. And so the federal government is saying we do not support mandatory vaccinations. And yet the state governments are saying to people like me, like I'm a normal person and I'm just a guy trying to live life. And I can't visit my children here or really be in society at all, because the only places you can go, I could go if I were unvaccinated, would be Woolworths, like a Walmart, just groceries. That's pretty much it. Everything else is off limits. you cannot enter. And they have security personnel to varying degrees at every business to say, are you vaccinated? If not, no-go zone. And so it went from available for to encouraged to mandated. And now it's all this thing is double vaccinated. That's the process where you've got the big tick. The thing that scares me is they've just said that the booster is available to those at risk. And I can see it coming, going from available to encouraged to mandated. And I refuse. The line in the sand I have drawn at a personal level to say, I can't be at the whim where I've got an app on my phone that turns orange and then red that says I'm free for 6 months if I get this medical procedure that I do not want, that I do not feel I need.
Well, 22 studies show the vaccines run out of coverage now after about 6 months. And so, if this is about protecting yourself, because the vaccines don't stop any spread of illness. So when you take a vaccine, you don't protect anyone else. But if this is all for your own benefit and to protect you against hospitalization and death, and there is a modest prevention of hospitalization and death due to the vaccines, and I do mean modest, in a paper by 1040 and colleagues, which is the best data we have on, vaccinated, unvaccinated, specifically in the hospital for COVID-19. It was published in JAMA. For those vaccinated who died in the hospital of COVID-19, the death rate was between 6 and 7%. And for those unvaccinated who died in the hospital, the death rate was between 7 and 8%. So it's very slight, very modest benefit of receiving the vaccination. It's not randomized. So that still could all be selection bias. People who took the vaccine had better survival factors. It's simply, for you, it's not compelling. You could take a vaccine if you wanted to, but you'd have to factor in the risks. In the United States, in our US CDC VAERS system, we've already had 19,000 people die after the vaccine. Two analyses, one by Rose and one by McLachlan, have shown 50% of the deaths occur within 48 hours of the shot, 80% occur within a week. We've had over 250,000 emergency visits due to the vaccines, over 30,000 permanently disabled. So among 200 million people who took the vaccines, we fully have 1 million who've been injured. And so that 1 million are now new patients to the healthcare system, and they have serious problems. Our FDA has warned us that the vaccines cause myocarditis, heart inflammation. And a recent paper by Trong and colleagues from the University of Utah in Salt Lake shows that this easily occurs up to age 40. Jessica Rose and myself in Current Problems of Cardiology have shown it extends up to age 50 in a larger data set. And this is serious. In the Trong paper, about 3/4 were hospitalized due to it. An analysis by Tracy Hogue showed 86% in her analysis. The original CDC analysis of myocarditis, 90%. I'm telling you, the vaccines are putting people in the hospital, and then in large numbers of people leading to death. And so because of that, there's tremendous justified vaccine hesitancy. In America, people don't want the vaccines. They did go down the pathway of being mandated, and that was strongly resisted. And now the vaccine mandates linked to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services through President Biden have been overturned in the entire country. And we anticipate this will go to the Supreme Court, but they're overturned. The governors very quickly then put into executive orders bans on vaccine mandates. And then any employer that requires a mandate must offer an exemption to people who don't want it. So that happened in Texas just a few days ago. So, we've had our freedoms defended. In Texas, we've never been locked down. We've been open the entire time. We go out to restaurants. We cross borders freely. Texas is really no different than Australia. It's got a vibrant economy. It has, a large population here. I think close to 30 million people live in Texas. Australia is what, about 20 to 30 million?
23 million. Yes, about the same.
Yeah. So Australia and Texas are similar. Australia is a bigger landmass, but Australia could take the roadmap that Texas has taken and be perfectly fine. Our football stadiums are open. Our economy is vibrant. We have a very diverse population. Now, sure, we've had COVID, but COVID has been very manageable at our hospitals. Our hospitals have never overflowed. And the only people who get hospitalized are those who are denied early treatment. And as long as they get early treatment, I have patients in my practice today that are getting monoclonal antibody infusions. They're getting the other drugs appropriately prescribed, and they get through the illness. Now, sadly, I've had a few cases that I've advised on that have passed away, just like I have in the last year with influenza. I've had some patients pass away of stroke and heart failure. This happens in people who are elderly, who have other medical problems. But if Australia tomorrow just adopted the roadmap that Texas has provided, everything would just melt away. All of your anxieties would melt away, Glenn. Everything would be back to normal. You'd see your children for the holidays. You'd have, a robust economy, a robust lifestyle. No one would be threatened. There will be COVID-19, but it'll be very manageable.
I've got 3 questions here that I do want to get to before you go. And I just took the notes down because they pop into my head. Firstly, when there are terms like mandate, and I've heard you talk about how to literally require me personally, but everyone here in Australia for other reasons, but coercive tactics, like if you don't get this vaccine, we have now a 2-tier system where certain freedoms are afforded to what we deem arbitrarily as the vaccinated. And for now, that's double, but I'm predicting it'll be triple soon with this booster. So that there is, like, I've heard some definition somewhere that we must be free to not be coerced, that, medical, volunteering for medicine must be, without coercion. And so we definitely have it. And then we have, I've heard you mention the Nuremberg Code, that to go against that is in violation of that. And so us people who have the opinion that I do, we take solace and we go, wow, finally someone who's intelligent, who's qualified, is saying what I suspected were true. And yet, at a practical level, those things like someone saying a mandate isn't a law until it's passed in Parliament, and those, yourself saying that this is against the Nuremberg Code, that doesn't help when our politicians have a police force with weaponry at borders that aren't allowing us to live our lives. So it's almost like, well, that's all well and good that it's against the Nuremberg Code. Who's the police officer of that? Because I need to point them at certain people in our upper echelon of society. What is something that, where's the end game for us? Move to Fort Worth. I got a friend in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm off.
Come on, you can stay at my house, Glenn. Listen, it is almost as if a foreign power has been installed and is now ruling Australia. It's almost as if Australians aren't ruling their own countries. Australians didn't vote for these mandates. I bet if you took a poll, the vast majority of people don't want them and don't see them as useful and feel like their civil rights or human rights are being violated. The Nuremberg Code comes out of the Nuremberg trials in Nazi Germany, where doctors committed atrocities. Doctors did, because they coerced patients into Nazi research, which was a whole series of atrocities. And so the Nuremberg Code says that no one, under any circumstances, may provide any pressure, coercion, or threat of reprisal for participating in medical research or a medical procedure that they don't want to undergo. And the second really important principle is called the Declaration of Helsinki. There are declarations that say everyone must receive fair balance, risks and benefits, and in full informed consent. And so the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki are being violated by these mandates, which are unwanted and have never been voted upon. The population hasn't agreed to this. So the Australian population hasn't agreed to these mandates. So it's almost as if a foreign power has been installed into your country against the will of the people. And now you're left with this conundrum of what do you do?
Well, it seems like, and I'd almost like, because they mentioned there's a new drug, and supposedly they, the people on one side of the debate are saying that it is almost like a respect ivermectin with similar functionality that none of us non-medical personnel are familiar with. And it's almost like, okay, fine. If you're just charging us top dollar for something that's basically a clone of something else, a protocol that works, say the McCullough protocols or whatever, fine, charge us the money and let's end this. Because you're right that we didn't have what we call a referendum, which is when they have something important, they go to referendum. They ask every Australian, what do you want? And they haven't done that. There's just been some, what we see as either scared and reactionary premiers who are so worried about their political career, they are locking down one thing without even acknowledging the kick-on effects of what that is doing elsewhere. I sort of am wondering, is this just that they've got a job where they can't win? Because if they let it go and there were 1,000 deaths on their watch, perhaps that's equally as unacceptable to them as the freedoms they're taking their citizenry, taking away from their citizenry.
Yeah, I think there is a part of that. Many would say, listen, no matter what were the drivers, that governments have gone down the wrong path, right? There's been a series of wrong choices. The vaccines are not sufficiently safe or effective. Denying patients early treatment has caused harm. And once you're far enough down a pathway, how could the perpetrators, if you will, how could they actually capitulate? How could they actually turn around and say, wow, we were wrong.
Are they pot committed, as they say in poker?
Say it again.
Are they pot committed, as they say in poker?
Yeah. So at some point in time, people have used the analogy of Nazi Germany. And in Nazi Germany, in the end, what happened is when doctors realized the atrocities that they were participating in, many committed suicide. That it was just when they started to realize that, in the United States, we've had 800,000 deaths. I've testified under oath that 85% could have been prevented. Virtually all of them were denied early treatment. So they suffered at home until they couldn't breathe anymore into the hospital. And then the virus basically slaughtered them in the hospital. And that the vaccines are not sufficiently safe or effective. 19,000 people have lost their lives. Over 30,000 permanently disabled, over 250,000 emergency visits. Patients in our country voluntarily go to vaccine centers, most of which have been dormant now for many months, or they go to a local pharmacy, but they're not administered the vaccines in doctors' offices. And so doctors really have no role of either, advising on taking the vaccine or not advising the vaccine. Good doctors have never recommended or not recommended the vaccines because the United States did research. So I was neutral on the vaccines, and about 70% of my patients took the vaccines. But many are regretful now because they realize they took a lot of risk. Obviously, those who suffered injuries are very regretful. Sadly, in my practice, I've had one patient die, can't get that back. So, every day that goes on, vaccine hesitancy gets stronger and stronger because more people die and are injured. So you can imagine those who are promoting the vaccines, each day they lose ground. They don't gain ground. Each day they lose ground. So each day that goes on in Australia, those who really want these mandates and those who really want more vaccination lose ground. It is a losing battle in the end. They will lose in the end because sentiment changes one by one, always against them because the vaccines don't provide any benefit. So the idea that someone's going to be grateful they took a vaccine, they get no significant benefit from the vaccine. So no one can ever say, wow, I'm so glad I took a vaccine. I'm going to take another one. It's only a one-way street of regret.
Well, there last weekend, every weekend there are protests in our streets every weekend. And I believe the number around the country last weekend was 1 million people. It might've been the weekend before, but someone was saying there was 500,000 in Victoria, about 1 million people. So that is, think about that as 23 million as a percentage. That's like 5% of our population hit the streets to say, no, we don't want it. And that includes people like me, that by today's definition, I am fully vaccinated, coerced, but I have the tick. And I didn't go and march. So what I'm thinking is if there are 1 million people physically on the streets, there might have been 2 or 3 of me who didn't go, but who absolutely believe in what those people believed in. So I hope that what you're saying is true, that eventually the people who even are vaccinated who regret it, which is me. I sort of feel I didn't have a choice. See my kids is not a choice. I'll take that small risk, but I can't take it forever, which leads me to the next question that is really heartfelt on my heart, very personal, but I hope me asking it helps someone else. If they're saying that everything that you put in your body, including a peanut, there is some risk of whatever it might be. What's that word? Anaphylaxis, whatever. No matter what it is, there's some risk. And certainly with an experimental vaccine, there are some risks. And they would say, oh, but out of the 20 million doses, that risk is nominal because, etc. Granted. But what I wanted to ask with regards to my kids, age 12 and 13, the risk of COVID to them seems so negligible. How could I, as a parent in good conscience, recommend when they start saying your kids must be vaccinated or they can't go to school? That hasn't happened yet, but I see the writing on the wall. When and if that happens, how could I in good conscience allow that to occur, them to accept a risk of something that is definitely there, albeit low, versus a risk of COVID, which is maybe there, but even lower? And perhaps even rob them of the robust immunity that you've talked about. I believe I heard you saying it with Bret Weinstein. Again, please, Dark Horse podcast, guys, go and have a look at that intelligent conversation. You'll listen to Dr. Peter McCullough and Bret Weinstein, two geniuses, instead of some idiot from Australia who's a complete layman. But yeah, do you see what I'm saying there about the immunity that my kids would get? I'd rather them lick the COVID tree with appropriate protections than give them a vaccine. And yet my government may be insisting that I expose them to that risk.
Glenn, there's been an analysis that addresses your dilemma, and that was published by Tracy Hogan colleagues at the University of California, Davis, using the VAERS and VSafe data. Now, it was children aged 12 to 17, but that analysis clearly showed that a young person is more likely to be hospitalized with myocarditis than ever get COVID and become hospitalized with COVID. Now, that's in the United States, where we have a high density of COVID. In Australia, you have a much lower density of COVID, but yet you still have the same risks of myocarditis per injection.
And is myocarditis a heart thing? Like, is there, because I've heard the term myocarditis, I've heard the term, I think, pericarditis. What are those things?
The two are contiguous. So myocarditis is inflammation of the heart muscle caused by the vaccines. And then when the heart muscle gets inflamed, the adjacent sac around the heart, the pericardium, becomes inflamed. So we use the term myocarditis/pericarditis. The CDC in the United States in June had 200 cases they reviewed. We now have 15,000 cases. Normally in the United States per year, we'd only have a couple hundred cases. So this is astronomical, the number, and this is heart injury. That means your kids sustain some heart injury. And the question is it a small enough heart injury where they don't have permanent heart failure or impairment, or are they in trouble? We know from a paper by Teshope and colleagues prior to COVID-19 vaccination that about 13% of myocarditis cases do lead to permanent heart injury. So sure, everything's rare, but the bottom line is when it happens to your kids, it's not rare anymore. It's 100% in your kids. And no parent who cares about their kids would take that risk. That's the reason why in the United States, we have FDA warnings. The FDA warnings say don't vaccinate these children because of risks of heart damage. Some countries have taken children off the table. That, again, the risk-benefit relationship is not in favor of vaccination, and we just don't put our children in harm's way.
Yeah, it seems to be against that. Again, we talked about before, that Hippocratic oath. It seems like, how can that be that this is being regulated almost by the wave of a pen by, our equivalent of a governor and his crony, his chief medical officer, which is how it felt to us. They would do daily press conferences where they would have very sweeping statements. The amount of times I heard one of our premiers say, keep Queenslanders safe. It was almost like a hypnotic incantation designed for us to be indoctrinated by that language. It scares the hell out of me. So it's not yet get vaccinated or can't go to school, but if it comes, I don't know what us Aussies are going to do. But what I do have some optimism for, that it seems because it seems these people aren't following their own medical intuition. Doctors across the country, our chief medical officers, etc. What they are seeming to do is following other countries. So I just hope that the lead that is being set by America in some of the ways you're describing, that they follow that lead and they start going down that path, because that means less restrictions, not more. So the last question I had was around this, and I will be quick because I'm very aware of your patient needs within minutes. So in West Australia, again, my home state, this was, there it is. This was their official government website that says in 2019, there were 23,000 cases of influenza. And in 2020, 1,000, so 5% of that, 23,000 down to 1,000. And in 2021, basically the flu, admittedly, that little up arrow means it is not yet current. So for the first 3 months of this year, no flu. So what would be, like, with regards to PCR tests, I have never heard of a cycle. I've never heard of a PCR test. I'd never heard of anything prior to this insanity. How can the flu be gone? Are these tests just, I mean, I hate to be the bleeding obvious idiot, layman knows nothing, but are these tests just detecting the flu? Is the flu gone and COVID's everywhere? You see where I'm going with this? Like, that's an official government website saying there is no flu. COVID, no flu. What's your take on that?
Well, those data show that during your peak in Australia, and it's glad your peak is over with, your peak time, there was almost no influenza. So it was a peak of COVID and no influenza. We know that our Center for Disease Control, its original methodology on the polymerase chain reaction test, the PCR test, its initial basically methods that was disseminated to all our government offices through our departments of public health, it could not distinguish between influenza and SARS-CoV-2. So it's indistinguishable. They depend on certain primers, what's called primers. And there's typically 4 primers: the spike protein, which influenza doesn't have, the nucleocapsid, the envelope protein, and the polymerase, RNA-dependent polymerase. So it may have been one of those primers that just basically had homology with influenza, and so you couldn't tell the difference. The question is, in Australia, did they adopt the same CDC methodology in your testing centers, or did they not? In the United States, we had commercial labs come in like LabCorp, Quest, Abbott, Roche, Ortho Clinical Diagnostics. And our understanding is their methodologies of PCR are sufficiently different than CDC that we're not going to have that problem. So our CDC is going to retire their methodology actually by the end of this year. The departments of public health are going to have to probably take on a commercial laboratory PCR, which honestly is better. We've been relying on those right now. The main thing on the PCR is to make sure the cycle thresholds are below 28, so we don't keep having the machine run and generate false positives. So even our CDC has that guidance. I'm suspicious in Australia, based on the data you showed me, that you had methods similar to the CDC. And so patients with influenza in Australia may have been misdiagnosed as COVID-19. Now that's a problem because the standards of care for patients hospitalized with COVID-19, including getting remdesivir, which has hepatic and renal toxicity, and we wouldn't want to give that to an influenza patient who is misdiagnosed as COVID-19, as well as corticosteroids. Dexamethasone, as an example, is common. We wouldn't want to do that for influenza. Now, in other countries, they use favipiravir, like in Japan, Russia, and India. Favipiravir or Ativan, that actually is originally approved for influenza, and it's also used for COVID-19. So in some countries, it wouldn't be such a big deal if the treatments are similar. But here, I'm worried for 2 reasons. That one, that your peak of COVID may represent in part actually misdiagnosed influenza as COVID. And number 2, your hospitalized patients with misdiagnosed COVID were inappropriately treated.
Well, they weren't treated at all. So there's the good news. They were told, here you go, have some fluids. And certainly our treatment protocols have been virtually non-existent. So Matt, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much. What I will do, guys, given that this was just the tip of the iceberg, but what I'm glad we didn't double up on much information from Bret Weinstein's interview and Joe Rogan. So please, if this has certainly resonated with you in any way, do avail yourself of those interviews. Do avail yourself of, which I will be doing, the McCullough protocol, which goes through treatments. And then we go and beg our doctors, this is what I want. Tell me why I can't have it. And then hopefully the political influence of us as citizenry can start to impact some change where we get back to some sense of normalcy. But Dr. McCullough, I cannot thank you enough, sir. I know that for you to join us down here, literally hours after your Joe Rogan interview dropped, it's certainly my partner, Naomi, was impressed. She couldn't believe that Joe's most recent guest was mine at 2 a.m. So, sir, I thank you for your efforts, not only putting some of my concerns, giving me some insights, but those interviews with those two gentlemen who I greatly admire, I now throw you into that category of the people who I do greatly admire, and thank for your, I've heard you described and your peers who are fighting this fight as American heroes. And so I hope that's not accepted with too much hyperbole, because I genuinely think history is going to look back very fondly on folks like yourself, and maybe not so fondly on some of these folks that are maybe acting in interests other than the greater good. So I thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, Glenn, thanks so much for the interview. And to follow me, you can go to America Out Loud Talk Radio, The McCullough Report. So America Out Loud Talk Radio, The McCullough Report. I file a weekly report to the nation and to the world on COVID-19. That's cited and gives the updated information. And it's a podcast. I have fun sections to it. I even have one regarding music that is now related to the pandemic and the crisis going on in the world. So anyhow, America Out Loud Talk Radio, The McCullough Report. See you over there.
Wonderful. Will do. Thank you again, Dr. McCullough. Much appreciated.
Okay.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.